Thank you, everybody, and good morning. So I've got about 3 or 4 topics I want to cover today. Just some updates of the things that are on my mind going into 2022 as we think about weed control and soybean. So first one that's actually on my mind, we're going to talk a little bit about horseweed or Marestail. This is a weed that most of us really didn't deal with in 2021, and I want to talk about it because it's on my mind again, because I think a lot of us will see this weed again heading into this upcoming year. So a few things I want to talk about with horseweed biology and some of the reasons why I expect a resurgence. So horseweed acts as both a winter and a summer annual, but primarily within North Dakota, we think about 90% of our populations are winter annual germination patterns. So emerge in the fall, overwinter, and start bolting in the spring. We do have, again, that maybe about 10% of our populations that emerge only in the spring. Those are kind of a different set of tactics that we have to deal with compared to these fall emerging ones. So the rest of the text on the screen is really some of the biological aspects we think about. Wind dispersed seed. This is a self-pollinated plant. So even though we do have resistance to glyphosate and our group 2 herbicides like first rate, it doesn't spread as rapidly, the resistance traits, as something like a water hemp, because these plants are self-pollinated. But since we have that wind dispersed seed, even if you did not deal with horseweed in last year or the year before, doesn't mean you can't have quite a few seed blow in and become problematic in future years. So why did we not deal with a lot of horseweed in 2021? And again, for those of us with short-term memories, we have to look back into the fall of 2020. And most of us, of course, do remember that it was pretty dry, and in some areas pretty historically dry. So if you use Endon a lot, you can actually make maps similar to this. And so I pulled up from August through November of 2020, percent of normal rainfall at the Endon stations. And of course, Daryl Richardson might tell you that your mileage will vary. These only represent numbers at these specific towers. But of course, it paints a pretty good picture for just how dry we were in August through November of 2020, which is very important when we consider 90% of our horseweed germinates in the fall. And we do need adequate moisture and several moisture events usually to get germination and establishment of winter annual weeds in general, and horseweed being one of those. Now compare that to this past fall, so August through November of 2021. Now all of a sudden we're looking at most folks got about normal rainfall to above normal, some way above normal. The real exception might be this northwest corner of the state, still relatively dry in that August to November timeframe up in that corner of the state. But that means for the most of us, or the rest of us, we had a pretty near normal rainfall to above average. Now, the thing to remember with horseweed, that small wind-blown seed, it does germinate primarily from the top half-inch of the soil profile, and it thrives in no-till conditions. So even though a lot of this rainfall fell on very dry soil and we did not recharge the entire soil profile, in the case of germination and establishment of winter annual weeds, it really doesn't matter that we didn't recharge the whole soil profile. We really just need that top couple inches to get moist and remain moist for an extended time frame to get germination and establishment. So many of these areas, I believe we had sufficient rainfall and sufficient rainfall events to get this germination and establishment. And so for those of us with a good snowpack right now, we likely have many horseweed rosettes insulated from the current cold snap we're in, and will likely be problematic for us once we get rid of the snow and start warming up in the spring. So as far as soybeans are concerned, I've really compiled about everything I can think of for horseweed control into one slide here. So the first, and really broken into 3 different bullet points. So the first one being that we have to have our field free of horseweed or Marestail when we plant. So if you're into conventional tillage, aggressive tillage with a disc will certainly take care of any of those rosettes. They're not going to be very deep rooted. So as long as we really dislodge the top couple inches of soil, we should do a good job controlling most of those rosettes, but it does need to be pretty thorough. For those of us in no-till, that usually means we need a good burn down program for horseweed control. And so we can really break this into a couple different categories. One of really the golden standard before we got into dicamba and enlist crops was a paraquat, which is gramoxone and the metribuzin combination. So these two products together work synergistically on many of our broadleaf weeds. And then when you can, throw in a group 4 product. So the cheapest and oldest way to do this was 2,4-D, and that allows us to plant relatively quickly after making that tank mix burn down application. We've had the sharpened products now for over a decade. Those are pretty good products to use for horseweed burn down. So a number of different ways to get sharpened, but for the burn down head of soybeans, we can use 1 ounce, and 1 ounce is generally sufficient for burn down of horseweed. Even on glyphosate-resistant populations, though, we would want to include glyphosate. It does help increase sharpen activity on horseweed. If we're just talking specifically about the auxin herbicides, we don't want to rely on 2,4-D alone. Both dicamba and then Elevore, which we've had standalone for about 5 years now from Corteva, those 2 auxin herbicides are better on horseweed than 2,4-D by itself, specifically when it's cold outside in our burn down situation. So if I'm comparing Extend and Enlist systems and I'm burn down only for horseweed, dicamba will get a little bit of a benefit there in those cold conditions in the spring on horseweed compared to the 2,4-D systems. Again, Elevore, pretty equivalent to dicamba. We do have that 14-day waiting period for Elevore. And just for those curious, if you do have a rye cover crop established, the picture on the right is pretty much simply to remind me that when we do have a rye cover crop competing against this winter annual horseweed populations, that is also a very effective way to control horseweed. As far as cover crops, Greg presented some data on summer annual weeds. Some of our suppression may be biomass related, or usually is biomass related with summer annual weeds. For horseweed, it's a pretty good fit for trying to control that weed. Okay, now I did say we still have about 10% of our populations that are spring emerging, and so that's why we typically will recommend adding a residual herbicide for horseweed control. So in soybean, we really want metribuzin of about 5 ounces or more, or the Valor products or the Authority or Spartan products. When we're talking about residual control of horseweed, that spring emerging populations, those are really the 3 products that I'm going to target out for soybean residual control of horseweed. And then cleaning up things post-emergence. Again, what really kills us in soybeans is this multiple resistance, both glyphosate and ALS resistant horseweed. And so when you have those populations, we do have several of those around the state. That's where it's really easier to grow a grass crop like corn or wheat because of more herbicide options. If we are growing soybean, then we are really limited to using something like Liberty, dicamba, or Enlist, those traded technologies. If we don't use those traded technologies and we have this stacked resistance, then either non-GMO soybeans or straight Roundup Ready soybeans, no effective options in crop to control the Marestail horseweed. So again, that's kind of everything in one slide there about horseweed management in soybean. Switching gears to my second topic, a few things to talk about for the 2022 Weed of the Year, which is Kochia. And so again, we all know we kind of had quite a bit of Kochia in 2021 survive, go to seed, has been tumbling around the past couple months here and distributing seed wherever it goes. And so knowing we had so much Kochia go to seed last year, we just know we're going to be dealing with this weed in quite a few areas, most areas going into 2022. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it. And of course, statewide, still probably the top weed, the top broadleaf weed of concern. Primarily, it's drought resistance. It's a really good fit in some of our soils, some of our saline areas as a weed that can thrive in those areas. And the other thing that's becoming more concerning is we are just getting more and more glyphosate-resistant kochia around the landscape. Many areas we can basically count on the kochia becoming resistant. The eastern part of the state, that's becoming more common. A couple of years ago, some of these areas, you may have seen a picture like this, where Roundup Ready soybeans sprayed glyphosate, dead kochia right next to live one. And basically, resistance 101 is the live plants will go on to produce seed, And so we have shifted quite a few of our kochia populations to glyphosate resistant, which of course does have consequences for us in controlling kochia within our soybean crops. Go back a couple decades ago when we first found glyphosate-resistant kochia, and this is one of the first populations detected down in Kansas. Just again, I think a good picture showing kochia's its tumbleweed dispersal seed pattern, and then B, when we do start finding glyphosate resistance, if you're in an area that does not have it yet, this was a field that was fallowed and sprayed with just glyphosate, and then just the line of green there is just glyphosate resistant kochia that tumbled in from a field, I believe it was about a field a mile north of the field in this picture here. So similar to horseweed, just because you did not deal with kochia last year doesn't mean you won't be dealing with it this year, depending on where seed may have tumbled in from. Okay, so I covered some of the important points about Kochia biology while going through those slides. But one of the things we just need to continue to talk about is really the second bullet point here about the fact that a lot of our kochia does germinate very early, one of the first plants out of the ground, and the fact that we often deal with these mats of kochia wherever we have a large amount of seed fall off of a plant, where we have basically hundreds or thousands of seed and seedlings per square foot. And really those dense mats make coverage of a burn down application very difficult to deal with. And that's where we're starting to look at things like fall residual herbicide applications, really to help thin down those populations to make management in the spring a little bit easier to deal with. And so looking at some of our fall residual programs we might look at, I think most people have seen, if not this exact picture and slide, very similar ones. So we've talked a lot about Valor applications in the fall. Brian Jenks has done a lot of research out in Minot and No-Till, looking at the utility of Valor applied in the fall right before the ground freezes and residual control of kochia into the next spring. This picture I basically call a best case scenario, where the tank mix on the left was applied to the left half of this picture. And if we can get to early June with very good, close to 100% kochia control out of a fall residual, again, I'm going to call that basically a best case scenario. It's not always that good of control. Sometimes we may only get 30 to 50% control into the following June. But in my mind, what that helps us, even if we get 50% kochia control into the following June, that still gives us 50% fewer plants in these mats of kochia that we need to have coverage on with our burn down applications. So I've got two slides here that Dr. Jenks presented at the Wild World of Weeds workshop last week with some of his 2021 data. I just really wanted to show this slide, which is focusing on kochia control in the fall and spring. So fall of 2020, a couple applications of Valor followed by spring applied herbicides. What he's showing here in this slide is basically spring applications were made May 26th, and the first rating we're looking at is June 2nd, so about a week later. So in this case, the fall applications were not capturing the control we got into May in this particular data set, but we are showing what we can accomplish if we follow up that fall application with a spring application of something like Authority MTZ or something like Spartan and Sharpen tank mix together. And in most cases, whether it's that fall followed by spring program or a couple of our better spring programs on a light kochia density, he was seeing between 91 and 99% control of kochia about a week after burn down, go out 2 weeks and still basically above 90% control for most programs here on the slide. The one with less control was just glyphosate alone, and again, dealing with a population with some glyphosate resistance. I do like to highlight these two with Authority MTZ. One thing that we probably don't talk about enough, so we talk about metribuzin for its residual control of broadleaf weeds, and kochia, of course, being a target weed for residual control of metribuzin, but we can get some decent burn down activity as well. So I mentioned if we tank mix it with gramoxone, we get a synergistic reaction. And so especially when we look at it tank mixed with something like sulfentrazone and the Authority MTZ like products, that's a pretty good standalone product to get us a good start for controlling kochia in the spring and soybeans. just the other slide of data set from Brian I wanted to share was some burn down results from 2021. And again, in his area of the state, almost historically dry conditions going into May. And so keep that in the back of your mind. But when we look at burn down for kochia, gramoxone is still one of the best, if not the best products we have, even in the tougher conditions of last spring. Very good control on a high kochia density, again, 1 and 2 weeks after that burn down application. Sharpen by itself can be a little bit challenged. So 1 ounce of sharpen, in this case, only about 55% control. Again, similar to horseweed, if we have glyphosate in the tank, we will see an increased response, even on some glyphosate-resistant populations. Not going to get us up to 100, but it will be, in most cases, better than 55% control. And the other thing that Brian looked at, we have a newer product on the market called Reviton. Its active ingredient is tiafenacil, so very similar, same chemical family that sharpen comes from. And in cases like common lamb's quarters, very equivalent product on that weed, but it's not a kochia product. Is basically the bottom line here. So if you're looking at exploring using Reviton for your burn down programs, if it's priced better, at least the year that we've been able to look at it, it's just not a kochia product, not as strong as sharpen in the kochia burn down market. So again, I want to package everything kochia control that I can think of into one slide for soybeans. I'm going to assume glyphosate resistance in this slide. So if you still have some populations that respond to glyphosate, we can of course keep that in our post-emergence application timing. But so either conventional tillage, a good job tilling in the spring to start, or if you have kochia up and running when you want to go plant, we do need a burn down application. In this case, gramoxone or sharpen based, I'd probably prefer to see gramoxone tank mixed with metribuzin to get that synergistic reaction for our burn down applications. A pretty good start to control kochia that's up. As far as residual products for kochia, sulfentrazone, so the Authority of Spartan products, very good in the spring. Again, metribuzin, we get a pretty good response with metribuzin. The tank mix those two together in an Authority MTZ like product. Very good start for us on kochia. Valor and Zidua will both give us residual control, but maybe not quite as good as the Authority and Sencor type products. And then post-emergence for kochia control, we really want to focus on 2 to 3 inch kochia, really no taller than that. Once we start getting above 3 inches, kochia just has so many growing points. A contact product like Flexstar or Liberty, it's hard to get very good coverage. And even enough growing points once we're over 3 inches that products like dicamba become a little bit more challenged in killing off the kochia that we're dealing with. So these are basically the 3 best treatments we have post-emergence in crop. Flexstar is something we could use in any traded soybean. Otherwise, similar to what I mentioned with horseweed earlier, we're really pigeonholed into using something like Liberty Link soybeans or the Extend soybean system for that in-crop control of kochia. And then just a reminder again of 3 inches or less is really what we're dealing with. If we're trying to spray 12-inch tall kochia, we will often get a lot of survivors. And so, again, challenging weed. We have options. We just want to make sure we're timely with when we make these applications. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit, but sticking with kochia, I wanted to share some data that Mike Osley compiled. So these are data from both Mike Osley at Carrington and then Brian Jenks at Minot, looking at the Enlist combinations for kochia control. And so a little bit of background on the data set I'm getting ready to share is this was really a study that was initiated to look for antagonism or potential antagonism between glyphosate and glufosinate. So we started this research several years ago, knowing we could use both Liberty and Roundup within soybeans in the coming years, knowing there might be some antagonism between those 2 products. But then we did also include Enlist combinations, knowing that we could use all 3 in the E3 Enlist soybean system. So that's a little bit of background on the treatment structure. The data we're just cherry picking to present here is simply the kochia data in a non-crop situation. I had the same treatments over at Prosper, but a different set of weeds. So I'm really just showing the kochia data for this research. Again, kochia was sprayed at 2 to 3 inches. We did use 20 GPA as the carrier volume. and everything had 3 pounds of AMS as for an adjuvant. Okay, so data slide here, very loaded, but I want to pick out a few things to talk about. And so if we go down towards the bottom here, we have Enlist One by itself. So at 32 ounces, that's just under a pound acid of 2,4-D. And 7 days after application, based on the Kochia size, basically between 2 and 16% control. Once we go out to 2 and 4 weeks after that application, we basically got no response out of Enlist One by itself. So we're often asked, what does 2,4-D or Enlist One bring to Kochia control? We've known for years that Kochia is at least more tolerant or resistant to our lower rates of 2,4-D that we might use in small grains or corn. Now we're using close to a pound, and we're still not getting a whole lot of good control of 2,4-D by itself on Kochia that we might be using in crop. In this case, this is the Carrington data set. And so glyphosate by itself at a rate is really lower than we want to use, but just showing that glyphosate by itself, we were getting between 26 and 48% control. A week later, about 40% control as we go out to 2 and 4 weeks. So still some glyphosate sensitive individuals within this population, not a fully resistant population. If you add the two together, so glyphosate plus 2,4-D in the Enlist Duo product, we were getting about 60% control when we go out 3 to 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks after application. So relying on glyphosate or 2,4-D alone in the Enlist system is not going to give us the best Kochia control. We can utilize glyphosate, so Liberty type products, and that's what a lot of these other combinations here are looking at. So Liberty by itself, basically getting 90 to 85% control a few weeks after application. Pretty similar when we look at the tank mixes, either with Liberty plus Enlist Duo, so that would be all 3 products together. Liberty, glyphosate, and 2,4-D, and then various combinations, tank mixes of Liberty and Roundup here. So in this case, what we've seen is that Liberty would be carrying the load in the Enlist system. Again, that's why we really focus or talk about the extend systems on Kochia territory. Just dicamba is simply a better growth regulator than 2,4-D when it comes to Kochia control. And this slide just really summarizes Mike's thoughts on that data set, and I covered a lot of that as we went through the data. Okay, 2 more topics I quickly wanted to cover to finish things out here. About 2 weeks ago, we did get new Enlist labels. So unless you closely monitor when herbicide registrations are going to expire, many of us didn't realize that the Enlist labels were set to expire a few weeks ago. So the EPA and Corteva were working on getting new labels. They were announced on January 11th, and these are 7-year labels. So these should be good through January of 2029. One comment for me is that the registrations of Enlist One and Enlist Duo do reflect the EPA's new interpretation of dealing with the Endangered Species Act. And so I'll cover a few of that, a few of the points of why I make that statement. Well, one, the EPA has basically made that statement too, but the EPA has been under a lot of pressure from environmentalist groups and court systems, and how they've dealt with the Endangered Species Act going back to the 70s. And so due to basically some newer litigation with other products, they are taking a closer look at how can we mitigate potential impacts on endangered species, and currently it really seems to be at the county level. And I'll explain that again in another slide or two. Looking at Enlist One and Enlist Duo in general, more nozzles available is one of the bigger things to take away from the newer labels. We have gone to 1 rate only for the post-emergence applications. So going back to last year, we could use between 1.5 and 2 pints of Enlist One, for instance. Now it's 1 rate for use in soybean. So for the Enlist One, it would be 2 pints per acre is the post-emergence rate. Looking again, these 2 products combined, there are some runoff mitigation measures now in place. So similar to the Extend system, if there is a predicted rainfall within 48 hours, you are not supposed to make an application. Again, this is to prevent runoff off the field of the products. There's additional runoff mitigation measures. So I'll share what I'm calling the a la carte menu of picking different ways to mitigate runoff. That's now one of the new things on the label that we have to consider. Soybean growth stage, we've now reduced it. We could go through R2 last year. Now we can go through R1. So once we reach R2 or full bloom, applications will then cease to be legal. And then again, we have this mainly to address the Endangered Species Act. We do have some county level prohibitions, a couple. So nothing in North Dakota, a couple on the Minnesota side. I'm going to walk us through that. So first of all, just focusing on Enlist 1 now. So the standalone 2,4-D choline. So 111 nozzles. The new rate is now 2 pints per acre of Enlist 1. As far as both North Dakota and Minnesota, no county level prohibitions for Enlist 1 by itself. So none of these counties are specified that we cannot use in those two states. And we do have to work with this a la carte menu to manage runoff. Enlist Duo, again, the premix of 2,4-D and glyphosate, about 106 nozzles. The one application rate is 4.75 pints per acre. Looking at county level prohibitions, North Dakota, again, nothing. In Minnesota, there are 6 counties currently where we cannot apply Enlist Duo. We can apply Enlist 1. We can tank mix that with glyphosate, but the Enlist Duo product by itself cannot be applied in those 6 counties. And the same menu to manage runoff is applicable there. National level map. So here's just the counties on the national level and showing again those 6 counties in Minnesota where we cannot use Enlist Duo. And so here's the runoff table or the management mitigation table. And I would really encourage everyone to work with your Corteva dealer on working your way through this. This is relatively new, but basically based on your soil type, you have to have either 4 or 6 credits from this table, and they all represent different runoff mitigation measures in order to make applications. So one example I like to use, so if you're in soil groups C and D, if you go below the table, that means silt loams or clay loams, you would need 6 credits. So if you are a no-till producer, that gets you 4 credits, and if you have a cover crop, that's 2. Add those together, you have 6 credits, then you can make up to 3 applications of Enlist. So again, this is a pretty thorough table. All of these different mitigation measures are defined on the Enlist website, enlist.com/mitigation measures. Again, it's kind of a new thing on herbicide labels just for the Enlist products. And I would encourage you to work with Corteva reps. Seeing both Greg and Hans have turned their camera on, so I think I'm getting the hook here. So the last thing I was just going to cover real quick was the product shortage update. Not a whole lot of updates on this front compared to last fall. So basically continue to work with your dealers. The main things I'll point out. So glyphosate and glyphosate are really the 2 products I'm hearing most about as far as product shortages. Just the inability to obtain some of these, and certainly if you can't obtain them, expect a sharp increase in price. And so that's the main thing I wanted to point out with product shortages. Most of us will continue to hear about this throughout the winter. So again, I just want to point out from my perspective, what I'm hearing, these 2 products are the most affected by this shortage. Generic 2,4-Ds prices have gone up, but we should be good on supply of Enlist 1, the 2,4-D choline, and then clethodim, more use in season for us. So control volunteer corn and grasses might be tight, might be okay if we continue to get barges unloaded and products on trains into the right areas of the country. I will stop there. There's some contact information and a QR code for the electronic weed guide